Samson's downfall. In our last story, we saw Samson's strength and pettiness on display. He developed a rivalry with the Philistines over his wife, and out of anger and revenge he burned their crops and slaughtered 1,000 of their men with the jawbone of a donkey. God used Samson's strength and foolishness as a weapon against the enemies of Israel. Now we see Samson's descent into his own sin. His foolishness abounds, and he finds himself captive to a witch in the armies of the Philistines, as inspired by the book of Judges. It was dark, and the city of Gaza had fallen asleep. The only lights came from the dim candles illuminating the small room where Samson and the prostitute lay. Their shadows moved against the walls as they moved to one another's bodies. Throughout the night, Samson drowned out his sorrows and insecurities in the sheets of the prostitute woman. The Gazites had caught word that Samson was staying in the city. They surrounded the prostitute's home and set up an ambush at the gate of the city in case he escaped. They kept quiet, planning their attack for when dawn broke. They slept, not knowing that Samson escaped out the window at midnight. Stealthily, Samson moved through the alleys of the city towards the front entrance. Samson stood in front of the gate. The gate was looming over Samson. 4 times his size and made of pure steel, the gate stood as a barrier between him and freedom. Samson gripped the steel beams of the gate and began pulling. Samson's arms were hard as stone, and his legs were planted firmly in the ground for support. Slowly, the steel began to rip off its hinges, and the gate lifted from its foundation. Samson rose the gate above his head and began to walk out of the city. With the strength of an elephant and the stealth of a cat, Samson stole Gaza's main form of protection and escaped into the mountains. Meanwhile, the Philistines were planning their attack against Samson. The lords of the Philistines plotted and schemed as to how they would topple the mighty man of God. Clearly no army, large or small, could come up against him, and they knew no other way to bring him to his knees. They did, however, know of one weakness Samson had, a weakness for beautiful women. They sent for a woman named Delilah and paid her 1,100 pieces of silver to seduce him. She came to Samson with smooth lips and a sharp tongue. She stroked his hair and kissed his neck. Samson in an instant fell deeply in love with Delilah. Her seductive voice and clever words lured Samson into a daze of passion and vulnerability. She whispered in Samson's ear, "Where does your strength truly lie?" She leaned against him. Samson could smell her hair. She was intoxicating to him. How would anyone be able to capture you? Samson was enraptured by her, but still in his right mind to toy with her. Samson answered her and said, "The secret is 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried. Once they bind me, I become weak like any other man." So Delilah playfully bound Samson up, while the Philistines lay in secret, waiting to ambush him. Then Delilah tested the strings and yelled, "Quick, Samson! The Philistines are coming!" And in an instant Samson broke through the strings ready for battle. So the secrets of Samson's strength was still a mystery. Delilah was upset with Samson, but Samson continued to toy with her. 3 times she bound him, and 3 times he escaped, for he thought they were playing as lovers do. But Delilah only loved one thing, silver, and she would not receive it unless Samson was captured. Delilah wept in front of him, saying, "How could you tell me you love me when your heart does not trust me?" She cried, yelled, and pressed up against him and begged. Day after day she wore him down, and Samson became vexed beyond all reason. All of Samson's inhibitions melted like candle wax against Delilah's flame. So he told her the source of his strength. "I am a Nazirite by birth. A razor has never shaved my head, and if it did, my strength would leave me." Delilah was satisfied. In the secrecy of night she had Samson rest on her lap. She stroked his hair as Samson fell into a deep sleep. Delilah smiled as she looked at Samson, although she did not smile out of affection or love for him. No, she smiled because the Philistines were waiting just beyond the walls of her bedroom with her silver. She nodded towards the door, and a man approached Samson with a blade in his hand. Together they shaved off 7 locks of hair from his head. She tormented him, whispering lies and curses into his ears. Then with a loud shriek she yelled, "Samson, the Philistines are here!" The Philistines sprung onto Samson and tackled him off the bed, onto the floor. Samson struggled, waiting for a burst of strength to send the men flying through the wall, but he had no strength. You see, Samson's strength was not in his hair, but in the favor of God. Samson had spent most of his adult life straying from God, and he had now broken his last vow. The Philistines bound him and pulled his head back. The Philistine lords looked down at Samson with cackles. Samson looked behind them as Delilah counted her silver. Tears streamed down his face as he pulled and kicked in futility. Samson looked at one of the men standing above him. He turned to the fireplace and pulled out an iron rod. Its tip was orange from the flames. He slowly approached Samson and drove the tip of the rod into his eyes. Samson wailed in pain, and his screams woke up the entire city. The men drug him out of the house and shackled him to the wall of the Philistine temple. Samson knelt in total darkness. Weakness was new to him, and he yelled in pain through the night. The lords of the Philistines gathered together at the temple to make sacrifices to their gods, Dagon. Together 3,000 Philistines gathered to celebrate the capture of Samson. They drank, danced, and reveled in victory. The fire raged in the center of the large hall, and Samson could hear the snickering of Philistines passing by him. The Philistines called for Samson to be chained in the middle of the great hall to entertain the guests. Their hearts were merry and drunk, and they laughed at Samson and threw things at him as he was being brought to the center of the temple. They chained him between 2 pillars that held up the temple roof, and all 3,000 men and women mocked him. The music grew louder, and they worshipped Dagon into the middle of the night. Samson was lost in his thoughts. He was supposed to be the deliverer of Israel, and here he stood blind and bound. It was not the Philistines that trapped him there, but his own pride and lack of obedience to God. Samson raised his head to heaven, unable to see. He took a deep breath. "Oh, Lord," he shouted, "remember me and strengthen me, just this once." And then Samson began to pull on his chains that were attached to the 2 pillars. The Philistines noticed and laughed. Samson continued, and small cracks began to form around the foundation of the pillars. Samson screamed as he tore at the pillars. The Philistines' smiles began to fade, and Samson whispered to himself, "Let me die with the Philistines." And in that moment he bowed with all his strength and pulled the pillars apart. The entire temple floor fell from the sky, and the walls toppled on top of all 3,000 Philistines below. Flames erupted from the center of the temple as stones crushed the backs of God's enemies. A cloud of smoke covered the wreckage. Dawn had broke, and the sunrise peaked above the hills. In the middle of the wreckage, among the bodies of the Philistines, lay Samson's dead body. In that moment, Samson accomplished more in death than he ever could during his life. The strongest hero Israel had ever known experienced more victory and sacrifice than he did selfishness. The story of courageous self-sacrifice would be perfected later on in another hero God sent. His sacrifice would topple the greatest enemy of them all.